Now, dinosaurs are such familiar animals that they essentially don't need any introduction really, and this in itself is a really interesting point. So most people, whatever their age, nationality or background, they kind of carry with them a general idea of what dinosaurs are like. Imagine if you work on some obscure group of animals and you go and give a talk on them, you've got to spend half the talk just telling people what they are. You don't have to do that with dinosaurs. But for many people even today, this archetype or stereotype of what dinosaurs were like is based on, people are thinking of images like this. What I want you to remember is that this view of dinosaurs is decades out of date. And I'm one of quite a large number of people today who's quite unhappy with the fact that this really old school view of dinosaurs is still being popularized and bolstered by a specific film franchise. I'm not going to mention that particular film franchise today. Some of you might be able to guess its name. Dinopedia, this new book, is focuses specifically on what scientists currently think about dinosaurs, and more specifically it's kind of the story of how we got to our present understanding. And what might not be sufficiently appreciated is that it was a specific cultural event which started in the late 1960s and extended through the 70s, 80s and 90s that basically caused us to absolutely revise our view of dinosaurs and their world. And this event is known as the dinosaur renaissance. And what makes the dinosaur renaissance really special and very different from the various other revisions of scientific thought that have happened throughout history is that it was conveyed both to other scientists and to the public via attractive, popular books and artwork. This slide shows some of the works in question, and to people that were of the right age and that were lucky enough or privileged enough to have access to these works when they were new, well then those people got to see and experience the dinosaur renaissance as it was happening in real time. And this is a theme that I'll be coming back to later on in the talk, and it's something that I discuss repeatedly in Dinopedia. It's one of the main themes explored in the book. Now, let's kind of step back a little bit from this sort of historical narrative and think of the bigger picture. What are dinosaurs? The term dinosaur doesn't apply to just any old prehistoric animal. Dinosaurs are a specific group of reptiles. They're part of the major reptile group called the archosaurs, formerly Archosauria. And you should basically imagine Archosauria as the crocodile bird group. So yeah, as confusing as it might seem to conventional classification, birds are a subgroup of reptiles according to scientific classification. Dinosauria, the dinosaurs, Dinosauria is what we call a clade. So that is, it's a group of organisms where all species within it shares the same single ancestor. And as you can see from this very simple family tree here, it's generally been thought that early on in their history, dinosaurs split into two different lineages. The Saurischians, that's the group that includes the predatory dinosaurs or theropods, as well as the sauropods, that's the long-necked dinosaurs, and all their relatives. And then this other major group called the Ornithischians. This is the group that includes horned dinosaurs like Triceratops, armored dinosaurs like Stegosaurs and Ankylosaurs, the so-called duck-billed dinosaurs, and so on. And one thing you'll note from this diagram here is that birds, and there's a frigate bird as a sort of stand-in for all birds here, birds are part of that Saurischian dinosaur group. Birds are dinosaurs. Specifically, birds are one of the many subgroups within the theropods, the so-called predatory dinosaurs, and I'll be coming back to this point in a minute. It's a really important thing when we talk about dinosaurs today. I should add additionally that today we're in the middle of a really interesting debate that concerns the way in which the major dinosaur groups are related to one another. So what's shown here, where you've got dinosaurs falling into these distinct Ornithischian and Saurischian groups, this has been challenged, and there are now 2 or 3 competing versions of the dinosaur family tree. I'm not going to cover that discussion today. It's obviously quite, in-depth and technical. It is something covered at reasonable length in the book. And it's an issue that's caused quite a bit of consternation among specialists. And there's some hilarious hyperbole that's emerged from this debate in articles by journalists. I particularly like this one, the article at bottom left. An argument over dino history is tearing paleontology in two, says whichever journalist wrote that article. We are in a golden age of dinosaur discovery. This slide shows representatives of various groups that have only really become known within the past few decades. And that, again, that's a significant point. There are globally distributed, diverse, long-lived dinosaur groups, whole groups that we didn't know about until, the last couple of decades. Let's just look at a few of these groups as represented by the species shown here. The horned dinosaur on the far left there, that's Carnotaurus from the late Cretaceous of Argentina. It was discovered in 1984, which is actually quite a long time ago now, decades ago. And it's one of the earliest recognized members of a group called the Abelisaurids. They're now known to have been almost globally distributed during the Jurassic and Cretaceous, and they're currently represented by about 30 named species. The feathery animal with the big hooked thumb claws in the middle, that's Mononychus. It's an Alvarezsaurid from the late Cretaceous of Mongolia. It's a long-legged bird-like theropod. It's not very big. It would have been a couple of feet long, sort of pheasant-sized animal. It possesses numerous specializations for ant-eating. Mononychus was scientifically described in 1993, and its group, the Alvarezsaurids, they're now known from fossils found in Europe, Asia, North and South America. Today, they're represented by about 20 species. The peculiar winged dinosaur upper right, that's Iki from the Middle Jurassic of China. This is a membranous winged tree-dwelling little feathered dinosaur about the size of a feral pigeon. It was named in 2015, and it belongs to a group called the Scansauropterygids, which we've only known about since 2002. And at the moment, we only know of 4 or 5 species. And probably more will be named in time. And the spiky-necked animal at the bottom there, that's Bajardosaurus from the early Cretaceous of Argentina. It was named in 2019. Bajardosaurus is a diplodocid sauropod. The sauropods, of course, are the mostly gigantic, mostly long-necked plant-eating dinosaurs. And what animals like Bajardosaurus show, as is true of so many dinosaur groups, is that this supposedly familiar group actually housed more diverse, stranger looking species than the ones we consider more familiar. I'm sure you've heard of Diplodocus and Brontosaurus and so on. Well, Bajardosaurus is, something else altogether. Now, I could keep telling you about recently discovered unusual dinosaurs. There's just so many of them. In fact, even most experts, most specialists struggle today to keep up with all the new names, all the new discoveries. At the moment, we see currently about 50 new non-bird dinosaur species get named every year. Due to obviously current global events, 2020 and 2021 have both been unusual years. Scientists haven't been able to do the field work they normally do. They haven't been able to visit museum collections as they ordinarily do. They haven't been able to meet up with scientific colleagues, that kind of stuff. But even so, we are in week 42 of the year at the moment, and I think it's about 30 new non-bird dinosaur species have been named so far this year. Now, these graphs, don't worry about the numbers on them. I just want you to pay attention to the shapes of the graphs. Time is running along the x-axis, so from side to side, and notice that the slopes on these graphs are going up. That's because what you're seeing on these graphs is numbers of new dinosaur species named over time. And you'll notice that as we get closer to the present, the curve of the graph basically becomes almost a straight line. So we're seeing an enormous rise in the numbers of named dinosaur species happening within the last couple of decades. It's something like 90% of all known non-bird dinosaurs have been named since the year 1990 or 2000. I can't remember, but it's like nearly all the dinosaurs that we know about have just been named in the past 2 or 3 decades. Now, one of the things that, of course, everyone knows about dinosaurs is that many of them were gigantic. Dinosaurs as a whole were exceptionally good at evolving giant size, and by far the biggest were the sauropods, these quadrupedal, long-necked, generally long-tailed group of plant-eating dinosaurs. Even a small sauropod was something like 15 meters long, about 50 foot long, and would have weighed 10 to 15 tons. The biggest of the sauropods, like various of the titanosaurs and brachiosaurs that are shown on this slide, they reached about 30 meters, that's about 100 foot. They probably weighed over 80 tons. Our ideas on exactly how heavy they were vary because there's various different techniques used to estimate their masses. But whatever, these were by far the biggest land-living animals ever. But they are not, of course, the biggest animals ever, because as everyone knows, the blue whale is bigger. But blue whales aside, the fact remains that dinosaurs excelled at reaching sizes and dominating terrestrial environments in a way that mammals and indeed other animals never have. And why is this so? Well, there's this popular idea that you bump into quite often as a dinosaur specialist, that the unusual conditions of the so-called age of dinosaurs, which is properly called the Mesozoic, that this idea that, you know, unusual conditions during that time allows dinosaurs to rise to dominance. Maybe dinosaur success was due to the Mesozoic being warmer or having a different atmospheric composition, or maybe it was due to different gravitational conditions or something. Well, none of these ideas have any support. But what does have support is that dinosaurs actually were exceptional animals. They possessed a combination of features that just isn't seen in any other group of animals, and it explains dinosaurian success. And it also, I think, partly explains our fascination with them. Put very briefly, dinosaurs, right from the very start of their evolution from the archosaurs that were ancestral to them, they possessed erect limbs, highly acute sensory systems, a warm-blooded physiology, an ability to breed young, an ability to produce large egg clutches, super complex teeth. I should have put that image first. And a highly efficient respiratory system, which was coupled with a pneumatic system. Yes, a pneumatic system, a thing that's still not widely known outside of, you know, dinosaur specialists, is that many dinosaurs were pneumatic. They were air-filled. They had a series of air-filled sacs connected by tubes to each other and to the lungs, distributed throughout the body cavity and also throughout the skeleton. And as you can see from these x-rays, what this means is that in some dinosaurs, like certain sauropods, 90% of the skeleton, in certainly some regions of the skeleton, about 90% of the bone space was actually filled not by, you know, bone or marrow, but by air. And this pneumatic system, it seems really odd to us today. It is, however, present today in birds. It's normal for birds. And it would have had a whole load of consequences for the biology of non-bird dinosaurs, because they would have had huge quantities of air moving throughout the whole of their respiratory system. They would have been able to push air in and out of the lungs in greater volume and at greater frequency than is the case in animals like we mammals. This pneumatic system also means that dinosaurs were probably very good at dumping heat, again, more so than animals like mammals. And it also helps explain why dinosaurs were so good at evolving giant size. Their skeletons, their bones were much lighter than those of other animals, weight for weight. And it was also comparatively easy for dinosaurs to do things like evolve, you know, ridiculously long necks. The presence of inflatable air sacs distributed throughout the body might have had major consequences on the life appearance of some of these animals. Birds of many sorts have evolved distensible or inflatable pouches and sacs located just under the skin, mostly in the throat and chest, which are often brightly colored and used in sexual display. And now let me emphasize, this is very much an area of speculation, but we do wonder if the same thing was true of some or even many non-bird dinosaurs. In many of these animals, we see bony openings in the skull bones and neck vertebrae and so on that could well have been linked to the presence of similar display structures. It's quite plausible that some or even many non-bird dinosaurs, certain theropods, some of the giant sauropods, they could well have been ridiculously flamboyant. And this is the point I want you to remember. We'll be coming back to it later on. Now, on the subject of life appearance and bird-like anatomy, we have to talk about feathers and fuzz. It's been obvious for decades, literally since the late 1800s, that the mostly two-legged predatory dinosaurs, the theropods, it's been obvious that they have some affinity with birds and are probably ancestral to them. This is something that was initially noted by people like Thomas Huxley, so-called Darwin's bulldog, back in the 1870s. And over the years, scientists have often speculated on the possibility that feathers might have evolved long before birds did. Feathers might have evolved in theropod dinosaurs, you know, way before birds themselves actually evolved. I can remember as a student during the 1980s really hoping that one day we might find fossil feathers on a non-bird dinosaur. Well, this wish was finally fulfilled in the mid and late 1990s when two feathered non-bird dinosaurs, the long-tailed Sinosauropteryx, which you can see on the left here, and the turkey-like short-tailed Caudipteryx, both of which are from Liaoning province in northeast China, these two animals were discovered, and both of them preserve an unambiguous feathery covering. Sinosauropteryx has hair-like fibers that form a pelt all over its body. Caudipteryx has got more complex feathers. Certainly the feathers on its arms, hands, and tail are structurally identical to those of modern birds. They've got the same interlocking barbs and barbules that help feathers maintain their shape. Now, since those days of the mid-1990s, nearly 60 species of non-bird feathery dinosaur have been scientifically described. Obviously, this slide shows just a handful of them. And there's a long list of interesting things to be learned from this. An obvious one is that feathers are not unique to birds. In fact, but if you look at this family tree, it should be quite obvious. Birds inherited their feathers and virtually all of their other features as well from ancestral theropod groups. Another important takeaway point is that the extensive feathery covering that many of these non-bird theropods had mean they would have looked incredibly bird-like. As you can see from these various artistic reconstructions, many of these non-bird dinosaurs would very obviously have looked like archaic long-tailed birds. That animal at the upper right, by the way, that is Velociraptor. That's, you know, would have looked something like that in life. These animals would have looked something like long-faced ground-dwelling hawks or hawk-pheasant hybrids. They weren't quite like any living birds in particular, really. So the idea, which is still persisting thanks to that certain movie franchise I said I wouldn't mention, the idea that Velociraptor and similar dinosaurs look like big, scaly, bipedal lizards is quite offensive. And so far as I'm concerned, the sooner we move away from it, the better. I think it's quite, you know, it's done quite a disservice in terms of public education or miseducation. The feathers of quite a few of these non-bird dinosaurs have microscopic pigment packages called melanosomes present on their surfaces. And this means that people have been able to make a whole list of claims about the patterns and colors present on various of these extinct feathered dinosaurs. So Sinosauropteryx had reddy brown stripes along its tail and a dark facial mask. Anchiornis had reddy brown stripes along its tail, and no, it didn't. It had grey and black and probably white plumage across its limbs, body and tail, and a reddish feathery crest. And Microraptor, a small relative of Velociraptor with long feathers on its legs and feet, as well as on its arms and hands, was black and iridescent. It has recently been argued that the correlation between melanosome type and actual color is probably less secure than has been claimed. This is currently a very active area of research. It's quite controversial. Even if all of these suggestions turn out to be wrong, I still think we're in a really interesting position, because I can remember for decades people saying, don't even try speculating scientifically about the colors and patterns of extinct dinosaurs. You're just never going to know it. And yet now we've got all this evidence that is actually relevant to things that, you know, we've got at least some idea of what's going on. Now, all of these, well, nearly all of these feathered theropods belong to a group called the Maniraptorans. And this is basically the group that includes birds themselves, as well as the most bird-like of the non-bird theropods. So Velociraptor and its relatives are here. So are the bird-like troodontids, the oviraptors, and so on. What should be obvious to you by now is that members of many of these groups looked really quite similar, both in overall appearance and in numerous tiny anatomical details, to the archaic birds that are also part of this group. Now, due to history being the way that it is, European discoveries were made long prior to those of Eastern Asia and elsewhere. The oldest known feathered fossil dinosaur is Archaeopteryx, discovered in the Jurassic Solnhofen limestone of Germany in 1861. This slide shows both a reconstruction of what Archaeopteryx would have looked like in life, and also the famous Berlin specimen. That's the second skeletal Archaeopteryx specimen to be found. I say skeletal specimen because the very first Archaeopteryx find was actually an isolated feather. Due to its feathers and its proportionally long arms and hands, Archaeopteryx was conventionally identified as an archaic bird, as the oldest known member of the bird lineage. And this is a group that within Maniraptora is technically termed aviali. There's no end of names, you know, you can't avoid covering them you know, whenever you talk about extinct animals. Whether this is correct or not remains the source of debate. It might be correct. It might be that Archaeopteryx really is an ancient member of the bird lineage, but some studies find it to belong elsewhere, on, you know, to belong to one of the other branches on the family tree here. There's different ideas on what's true or not, but whatever, the important point that you should take away from this is that Archaeopteryx and other archaic birds are extremely similar in just about every detail you could consider to the members of these other Maniraptoran groups. So the idea that birds are somehow different or special relative to other dinosaur groups is absolutely contradicted by what we know. If you went back in time to the Jurassic or Cretaceous, you know, like 140, 130 million years ago or so, and if you observed a diversity of live Maniraptoran theropods, it just wouldn't have been possible to work out which one of the animals you saw was the bird, the one that was destined to give rise to birds as we know them today. When birds originated, they were merely one among many Maniraptoran theropod groups. Now, since the time of Archaeopteryx, when it was alive in the Jurassic, birds, of course, have evolved substantially, and within the past 70 or so million years, birds have become increasingly modified relative to other Maniraptoran groups. So animals like pigeons, owls, and crows, they are still dinosaurs, but they're highly modified relative to the ancestral Maniraptoran condition. I don't want birders or ornithologists thinking that the dinosaurian ancestry of birds somehow makes birds any less interesting or any less special. Of course it doesn't. But the point remains, birds are dinosaurs. Dinosaurs are not extinct. And when you look at gulls, or you eat chickens, or walk past feral pigeons, you are interacting with dinosaurs. They're an important group of animals today, represented by around 10,000 living species and literally billions of individuals. Now, finding feathers on fossil bird-like Maniraptorans was, you might argue, not necessarily surprising. But what's especially exciting is that among these recently discovered feathery non-bird dinosaurs are a selection that are not Maniraptorans. They are outside the group that includes birds and the most bird-like theropods. This is U. tyrannus. Again, it's from Liaoning province in northeast China. It's known from, I think, 3 near complete skeletons. at least 2 of which are really big. They're like 9 meters long, about 27 foot long. And Eutyrannus is a member of the Tyrannosaur family. It's fuzzy, it's thickly covered in a dense pelt or plumage formed of thousands of hair-like filaments. So here's proof that at least some tyrannosaurs, maybe only the species that inhabited cool or temperate environments, were fuzzy or feathery. As archosaurian reptiles, dinosaurs, of course, inherited scales from ancestral archosaurs, and we know for sure that dinosaurs of many sorts had scales on their bodies. This slide shows scaly skin on various Saurischian and Ornithischian dinosaurs. The filaments and feathers that we've seen so far all come from theropods, the group that includes predatory dinosaurs and birds. But here's another surprise. We now know that filaments, and it may be correct to term them feathers, this is actually a source of considerable controversy at the moment. These filaments or fibers, whatever you want to call them, they were also present on ornithischians. So that's the group that includes Triceratops, Stegosaurs, and so on. This is Tianulong. It's a small ornithischian from the Jurassic of China. And what you can hopefully see from the images of its fossils here, it has filaments covering its body. It's got a mane of especially long filaments present along the upper edge of its tail, and also its back and probably its neck and head, as is depicted in the life reconstruction shown at the bottom right there. This is Calindrodromius, another small ornithischian. This one is from the Jurassic of Russia. It has a scaly tail, but as you can see from those images on the right, it's got various filaments of different kinds, some of which emerge from a kind of like scale-shaped basal plates, which cover its neck, body, and limbs. And this is Psittacosaurus. It's an early member of the horned dinosaur group. So it's a relative of dinosaurs like Triceratops. It's from the early Cretaceous of China. It is scaly skinned, but one specimen has got about 100 long hair-like filaments lining the upper surface of the tail. So in the image at the top, if you look at the upper left-hand corner, you should see this kind of like fringe of hairs, and they're shown in close-up on the far left there. So it appears that filaments, not necessarily complex feathers, but filaments or fibers, were widespread across ornithischian dinosaurs, perhaps being limited to smaller species. If we look at another one of these family tree diagrams, we know that filaments and feathers were present in Saurischians. We've just seen them in a whole load of theropods, a whole load of predatory dinosaurs, and of course we know they're present in birds. And you've also just seen them in ornithischians, the big group that includes Triceratops, Stegosaurs, etc. So does this mean that filaments or fibers, and again, whether we call them feathers is actually the subject of debate, we're not decided on this yet, does it mean that these filaments or fibers were actually ancestral for dinosaurs? Did the very first dinosaur species, the ancestor of all other dinosaurs, was that a fuzzy little, filament covered species? Now, what I want you to notice from this diagram here is who are the closest relatives of dinosaurs? And the answer is the pterosaurs, this group of membranous winged flying reptiles from the age of the dinosaurs. Pterosaurs are not dinosaurs, they're kind of close cousins of dinosaurs. And pterosaurs were also fuzzy coated. We have lots of fossils from the mostly the Jurassic and Cretaceous, which show that pterosaurs of all kinds also possessed filament-like or hair-like or fiber-like filament structures, some of which were complex branching structures. And again, some experts think that these should actually be called feathers, partly due to their chemical composition, which is apparently very similar to that of feathers. Other people disagree. But the presence of filaments or fibers in pterosaurs could push the evolution of these structures, of these filaments or fibers, way down in the family tree, further back in time, to the animal that was ancestral to both pterosaurs and dinosaurs. So was the common ancestor at that point where pterosaurs come off the family tree there, was the animal there a fuzzy coated one as well? Now, at the moment, we don't really know what the deal is here. We've got various different competing options. It could well be that these filaments or fibers evolved independently 2, 3, or even more times. We basically need more fossils, preferably from the early Triassic, around about 250 million years ago. We want fossils that shed light on this issue. This is one of the biggest talking points in the evolution of archosaurs today. It's a topic that's been an area of active interest across the past 50 years or so. Now, another reason for the popularity of dinosaurs is that they were and are especially flamboyant animals. So crests, horns, spikes, spines, bony plates, dorsal scales, and other structures frequently decorate the heads and bodies of dinosaurs. And if we throw birds into the mix as well, of course, birds are among the showiest and most extravagant animals that there are. There's been a tendency among paleontologists to interpret all of these structures as having functional roles of some kind, that maybe they provided self-defense or they worked as heat collecting or heat shedding organs. It's entirely plausible that those roles did exist. If you look at similar extravagant structures in living animals, like say, deer antlers, antelope horns, elephant tusks, they're often multifunctional, but the primary role of these structures is in sexual and social display. And this is another area that's the topic of a substantial amount of controversy, discussion, and active research. I'm one of a number of researchers who's argued that extravagant structures in dinosaurs and in various other groups of fossil animals as well, I'm part of a group that argues that these extravagant structures predominantly evolved in order to attract mates and deter rivals. So in other words, their evolution was driven by the phenomenon termed sexual selection. Sexual selection often operates in opposition to natural selection. Sexual selection is all to do with maximizing your ability to basically contribute to future generations. Several lines of evidence support this view. Yeah, you could give an entire lecture on this subject alone, which I'm not going to do now. But one of these lines of evidence is that the structures concerned, here's another fairly scary looking slide, but you only need to worry about the broad trends, not the detail. A lot of these structures exhibit what's known as positive allometry. And what this means is that the structures grow at a rate much faster than the general background growth rate of the whole animal. So if you think, for example, about the plates on the back of the Stegosaurus, so this is what's shown in that graph upper right there. The plates are small in juveniles, but as the animal goes through its teenage years, all of a sudden the plates start growing at an unusually fast rate, which means that they've reached full size by the time the animal is at sexual maturity. So the plates exhibit a growth rate that's faster than the general background growth rate of the organism as a whole. And if that's the case, if the structures only reach full size, they're only fully formed at breeding age, this is very suggestive of a role in sexual display. As I've already said earlier, we've got good reason for thinking that non-bird dinosaurs had excellent senses. Like living lizards and birds, they almost certainly had excellent color vision. When you couple this with the prevalence of these extravagant structures on these animals, also with what I said earlier about inflatable display structures and so on, I really think we have to imagine that the dinosaurian world was a visually remarkable one. Dinosaurs of many sorts just would have been incredible to look at. They would have been incredibly showy, brightly colored, flamboyant, prone to engaging in visual display. On that note, we know from fossil tracks, from associations of skeletons, from bone beds, we know that non-bird dinosaurs of many kinds were social animals, living and moving in groups, forming nesting colonies, living their younger years in bands with their brothers and sisters. It is, of course, entirely likely that some or even many dinosaur species were mostly or entirely solitary, but as a generalization for the group as a whole, that this was a socially complex, highly gregarious group of animals, and it's really fun to imagine their life cycles, their annual breeding events. This is a rich and exciting view of the Mesozoic world, but at the same time, it's a really frustrating one because there's just so much that we'll never know. We can only speculate on the relationships that must have existed within dinosaur groups, between competing or even cooperating species. We really should assume, based on what living archosaurs do, both crocodilians and birds, we should assume that non-bird dinosaurs used a complex array of postural signals, that they were noisy and highly communicative, that their mating and courtship systems were complex, and so on. There's just so much we're left guessing about, which I don't know if that makes the study of dinosaurs more interesting or more frustrating, but it's something we think about a lot. Now, I said right at the start of this talk that it was a key cultural event, the dinosaur renaissance, that drove virtually everything that's happened since the late 1960s. And one thing I've aimed to do in Dinopedia, and I should have actually waved around a picture, a copy of the book, because I have copies to hand. I won't be selling them over Zoom though. One thing I aim to do in Dinopedia is not just review our knowledge of of intellectual events like the dinosaur renaissance, but also to step back a bit and reevaluate the conventional narrative that's always given on this subject. So the normal story about the dinosaur renaissance is that Yale University PhD student Robert Bakker realized during the late 1960s that the way in which dinosaurs were being portrayed was fundamentally wrong. In a series of technical papers and popular articles, Bakker argued that dinosaurs of many kinds, even giant ones, were athletic and fast moving, that the long-necked sauropods were terrestrial, they weren't swamp dwellers, that birds were dinosaurs, and that almost everything said about dinosaur anatomy, bone structure, feeding behavior, and even community structure and evolutionary tempo demonstrated warm-bloodedness for dinosaurs. So in short, Bakker's argument was that dinosaurs were one of evolution's greatest success stories. Bakker's claims were controversial. They challenged kind of mainstream views at the time, and they were exciting, and they encouraged a huge amount of discussion and arguing. In 1969, the North American Maniraptoran Deinonychus was described by John Ostrom. John Ostrom was Robert Bakker's PhD supervisor, and Bakker got to produce this iconic reconstruction of Deinonychus for Ostrom's main technical study of this dinosaur. Deinonychus was so amazing. It was a highly agile, fast-moving, relatively intelligent, bird-like theropod with formidable claws on both its hands and feet, that it immediately became the poster child for Bakker's message for the dinosaur renaissance in general. All of this work, all of these studies and articles attracted journalists who started writing about the dinosaur renaissance in popular scientific venues like Scientific American, National Geographic, and also in various books. The narrative I've just provided basically pins everything on Bakker. This is a heroic narrative, with Bakker being basically functioning as the lone maverick or heretic who's driving everything that's happened. I do think that all of this is undeniably true. I do absolutely agree that Bakker's writings had a huge influence, and that his writings, his statements, and his illustrations were crucial. But I think there's a larger, more nuanced story that's partly been overlooked. And this is that the timing of the dinosaur renaissance was ultimately linked to 20th century history as a whole. In order for scientific claims to be made, you need the relevant materials, and in the case of paleontology, that's fossils. And you also need researchers who are of the right age, who are at the right positions in their careers, who are in the right economic and social situations to study the materials and make conclusions based on them. The ideas that Bakker and Ostrom too promoted were based mostly on fossils that had been discovered in the decades following World War II and were mostly being studied by a post-World War II community of scientists who, due to improving economic and educational settings, were increasingly able to engage with these fossils and their implications. I know that this slide doesn't just show post-World War II fossils. You can see that some of those things are from, were written about in the early 1900s, but things like, it's important as well that things like dinosaur feeding behavior, the origin of birds, dinosaur bone structure, and so on, they had actually always been topics of active research. It's just that there was very little of this research happening in the sort of first half of the 20th century. It's only sort of in the late post-World War II part of the 20th century that things really kick off, partly due to this socioeconomic event. It's not just down to Bakker. So rather than the Renaissance being due to Bakker's claims alone, it's probably more accurate to interpret the dinosaur renaissance as a perfect storm of events. And I put it that this change in our understanding of dinosaurs probably always would have happened, even if Bakker and Ostrom hadn't come along. It's just that it would have been a far, far slower, less kind of journalistic kind of event. And are we still in the dinosaur renaissance, or has it finished? This is a really good question. There are very different views on it. I discuss it in the book because there's actually quite a lot you can say about it. On to my final point, really, and this is one that kind of doesn't need saying because it's so obvious, but it also does need saying because paleontologists tend not to say it enough. And this is that the impact of art and artists has been absolutely crucial in our changing view of dinosaurs. Almost every single piece of dinosaur-themed news conveyed to the public is accompanied by attractive artwork. Art which depicts ancient animals is called paleo art, and today there's a substantial global active community of paleo artists who are very active on social media. Now, there's no denying that it's scientific advances, scientific discoveries, tedious, detailed, time-consuming, labor-intensive work, often involving cutting-edge tech and statistics and software, that gives us the detailed view of dinosaurs that I've discussed in this talk. But when it comes to things that make dinosaurs especially exciting, their overall life appearance, their interactions with each other and how they fitted into their environment, it's not the detailed technical stuff that grabs the attention of the public. Instead, it's attractive, often colorful artwork which depicts dinosaurs as vibrant, active, living animals. I would go as far as saying that probably the most important driver of interest in dinosaurs is paleo art, and that among the most important people in the dinosaur research community are artists. In Dinopedia, in the book, I talk about American artist Greg Paul quite a lot, because Paul really has to be considered responsible for the modern look of dinosaurs. Paul's work involves the creation of color paintings like those you see here, as well as black and white drawings, and also the production of these kind of high fidelity skeletal reconstructions. Now, these images were used in designing the look of the dinosaurs in Jurassic Park. And of course, Jurassic Park, released in 1993, had a massive influence, not just on the history of cinema, but on public interest in dinosaurs in general, including scientists. A substantial number of people working on dinosaurs today state that their interest as younger people was the result of watching that film in the 1990s. So this kind of serves as a good point on which to end. Perhaps another point that makes non-bird dinosaurs so fascinating and alluring is there's all this excellent science that's done on their fossils and on the pattern of their evolution, but at the same time, there's this substantial artistic contribution to how we depict them, how we portray them. Even if you're not that interested in the detailed anatomy of brain cases or how we reconstruct family trees, dinosaurs very much have a wonderful, spectacular aesthetic. And that's a point that makes it really ironic and annoying that there are projects that go out of their way to make dinosaurs look ugly or dull. Here I'm referring to the film franchise that I don't want to talk about. It's not not Jurassic Park, is the successor to Jurassic Park. So as I hope is obvious by now, your take-home points from this talk should be that dinosaurs were truly spectacular, amazing, visually flamboyant animals, that birds are one of the many dinosaurian groups, that we're in a golden age of discovery when huge numbers of new dinosaur species are being discovered on a regular basis, that the history of dinosaur research is very much connected to events in human history, and that part of the reason for our fascination with dinosaurs comes from their depiction in art and is therefore connected to our sense of aesthetics. Our interest in them is not purely scientific. I'll finish by reminding you that all of these issues and more are discussed in my new book, Dinopedia. Do buy a copy, please. It's small, attractive, highly affordable, $9.99. If you buy it, I hope you enjoy it. And that does bring things to an end. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
Darren, thanks very much indeed. That was truly excellent and very thought-provoking. And whilst people are gathering their thoughts for questions, I want to use my position to abuse it straight away and ask a question of my own. Given there were other furry and hairy animals around at the time of dinosaurs, what was the difference between the fur and the hair and the filaments on the dinosaurs? And was it the filaments that led to feathers and birds, if you like, or was it actually the more important thing, this sort of hollow bone structure, like bones? Was that the driving force towards flight?
There's quite a lot to unpack there. So we know.
Just giving people time to think.
Should I turn off screen sharing or should I leave it on?
Yeah.
Turn it off. Stop sharing. All right, thanks. Yeah. So interestingly, filaments, fibers, structures that provide insulation to the bodies of animals to help them retain warmth. This has evolved multiple times on the history of life. So, for example, think of arthropods, how many times, fibers and furry coats and so on have evolved. It might be that once you start to generate heat internally and want to retain it, it might be that in some groups of animals, it's relatively easy to evolve fur or filaments, and different groups have done it in different ways. I don't know the first thing about the microstructure of arthropod filaments, but of course they come from different tissues than those which have grown into fur and fibers in mammals and also in dinosaurs. In mammals, the fibers are mostly made of a kind of keratin. They're a novel structure formed of, I think it's alpha keratin, a particular kind of keratin, whereas in birds, feathers don't have the same origin. They come from, they're totally novel in evolutionary terms. They don't share the same chemical structure as scales. They actually are novel structures formed of beta keratin, so they've evolved totally independently from fur and mammals. A really interesting complication here is that the scales present on the legs of some birds are actually radically modified feathers. So like the big scoots on the feet of chickens or whatever, believe it or not, are highly modified feathers. So we think that filaments evolved independently multiple different times in different groups. In dinosaurs, so to get to the second part of your question, Mike, dinosaurs started out with probably this insulative covering. They started out with an ability to become relatively small, as in like, chicken or crow sized. They also started their evolutionary history with this pneumatic system. So as soon as you get animals like that doing things that involve leaping from the ground, jumping around on branches, needing to be small, you could say those are probably, it's not like there's one specific function, it's probably a bunch of different things that probably mean that they are sort of always destined to become small animals with like a good leaping or gliding or fluttering ability. So, and in fact, in Maniraptoran theropods, that group that includes birds and velociraptors and so on, it seems that kind of flight or near flight, gliding or fluttering, that seems to have evolved independently 3 or 4 times. So it's almost as if predatory dinosaurs, theropods, were always destined to evolve kind of into animals that today we'd call birds. It just so happens that the one group that did it really well evolved tiny body size, a really good ability to disperse across great distance, an ability to be supreme generalists and eat like bits of everything. And as a consequence, that's the one group that survived the mass extinction event, whereas nobody else did. So yeah, there's a big narrative there. Good question.